Thank you, Mark. Now, welcome to Farage with me, Martin Daubney, standing in for the big man, Nigel Farage. Now, the UK is on the brink of a conflagration. We have regional conflict in the Middle East, a full-blown war in Eastern Europe, and now the government is being warned that British civilians must be ready to fight because we don't have a big enough army. You couldn't make it up. A new committee report from the House of Lords has said that the country must adopt the mindset of a nation under genuine threat. Lord Kitchener is no longer saying your country needs you, but the country is ordering you to fight for king and country. Now, to continue this conversation, I'm joined in my studio by my superstar panel, and tonight is the Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosindell, and, of course, Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner and activist. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Andrew, could I start with you? Successive governments have grappled with the issue of how do we make young people sign up to take up arms or be prepared to defend the realm. Hasn't been achieved by successive governments. Your mob didn't do a good job. I don't think that the current lot will be much better. Is it really the answer for the Lords to say, well, OK, you don't volunteer, we're going to force you to do it?
So, freedom isn't free. Our liberties are not something we can just take for granted. There are times in our history when we do have to fight to defend the freedom that we cherish. And my father was in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. Both my grandfathers fought in the First World War. So they had to go and fight for king and country on both occasions. Who knows? That might happen again in the future. I hope it doesn't. I don't believe it will, but you can never be certain. One thing I will say is that this country is a great nation, and we do rise to a challenge if we are threatened, if our freedom and our way of life, our existence is under threat. The British people do rise to that. The big problem, I'm afraid, is that, as you've rightly said, Martin, every government has failed to invest in our defences. I believe that we should at least be spending 3%. And I do hope the new government we have at the moment will match that, because if we don't invest in our defences, we pay a very high price down the road.
Andrew, we've been covering today on GB News the Homes for Heroes scheme put forward by Sir Keir Starmer. Upon first casual analysis, actually, it doesn't prioritise veterans. They will be behind the queue, behind asylum seekers even. So what does it say to people who might be thinking about joining the armed forces when they've finished their time? The government, successive governments, again, has to be said, they seem to care about them. They're simply thrown out, you've served your time, thank you very much, often being crippled by homelessness, by addiction, by being tossed onto the scrap heap. So until we show that we care about our armed forces and our veterans, why should they care about us?
You're completely right. We have failed our veterans. There's so much we should have been doing in recent years to not only look after those that have served Queen and country, but also to encourage more younger people to actually want to go into the armed forces. We should have invested a lot more in things like the Air Training Corps and the Army Reserves. I think they should be supported at local level, particularly in schools and outside organisations. I think that we've done a lot to encourage young people to go to university, haven't we? A lot of that, but very little to encourage people to actually join the armed forces. And I think we need, Peter's right, the conditions are a big factor. People decide not to go to the armed forces because the conditions are so bad. We need to change the mindset of this. But to do so, it means spending a lot more money. And I'm afraid the peace dividend that we thought we had in the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I'm afraid that was largely a mistake. We should have continued to invest in our armed forces, and we wouldn't be facing the problems we have today had we done so.
Now, Labour is looking to introduce a points-based system which will reward prisoners for their good behaviour. The Justice Secretary will look at a Texas-style point system which offers offenders courses on reoffending, drugs or alcohol to reduce their sentences. And the news comes after 37 domestic abusers were wrongly released from prison yesterday under Labour's controversial prisoner release scheme following its action plan to reduce prison capacity. Well, I'm still joined in the studio here by my superstar panel. That's the Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosindell, and of course Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner and activist. Gentlemen, thank you for your company. As Andrew Rosindell, Peter Tatchell's saying a lot of things there which no doubt would challenge your notion of law and order as someone from the Conservative right, being compassionate towards paedophiles, compassionate towards killers, might go get the instinct of lots of our viewers. But is punishment just about retribution? Is it about punishment, or is there some merit in a bit of humanity, equipping them to be better citizens if they're ever released?
Look, no one can disagree with the importance of rehabilitation and ensuring that when a prisoner goes into prison, that they leave prison perhaps as a better person, better equipped to go back into society and not to reoffend. So anything that can do what's happening at HMP Grendon, as Peter has outlined, that sounds excellent to me. However, punishment has to be there as well. You cannot just turn prisons into centres that people can go in and be given, lead a normal life in prison and then to go out, because then you're not discouraging people from committing those crimes. There's no deterrent. And I think that when it comes to sentencing, I've always tended to feel that we should have honest sentencing. Rather than actually let people out early, we should say, well, if you actually behave properly in prison and don't do bad things, then perhaps you'll go out when you're meant to leave rather than have it extended.
But
that's a better way of doing it.
But isn't part of the problem, though, is that successive governments, again, Conservatives, 14 years in power, and the Labour Party before that, haven't built enough NICs.
Well, that's all true.
So we're having to release people early because there's nowhere to store them.
We're facing this problem now because governments haven't planned. They haven't actually built enough prisons. The government are releasing people early, which I have grave concerns over. Now, 37 people have been released that shouldn't have been released.
Isn't that because the Tories didn't have enough capacity?
I'm sure it was.
And Labour have inherited this mess.
All governments have allowed this to emerge as a serious problem, and we should have been building more prisons. If you don't build enough prisons, there can't be a deterrent because people are let out far too early than their sentence was given in the first place. So that has to change. And the last government did make mistakes on this, but the idea that the solution is to just let loads of prisoners out early, as you could see the other week, prisoners uncorking champagne and saying, well, they're always going to vote Labour now because of it. This is not the way. There has to be punishment. There has to be deterrent.
No, they can't. Quick point, though. A lot of these cons are going to see this, go, oh, all I've got to do is go to a little drug rehabilitation course, tick a few boxes, sit in the corner, pretend like I'm bored, and I'll be out early.
No,
Thank you very much. They could game the system.
No, the system has to be, there's proof with results. And it has to be not just ticking boxes and prisoners saying so. The other thing we have to remember is that about 2/3 of all prisoners have mental, drug and alcohol problems. And unless we deal with those, they're going to be in a cycle of prison, release, prison, release.
But even so, you don't want to make it an attractive option for people to commit crime and go to prison.
No, we're not.
And people actually to want to go there.
No.
You have to make it a punishment as well. Yes, rehabilitate, but also make sure that people know that they're not going to enjoy the experience of going to prison. Otherwise, it defeats the whole object.
And it's worth pointing out that 20% of the cons that have been released recently by the Labour Party are already back behind bars. Maybe a lot of them want to be back there. Maybe they get 3 meals a day. Maybe they're kept nice and warm. Maybe they miss their mates, and maybe that's a problem. We have institutional dependence. We're back in the studio, of course, my superstar panel, Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosindell, and Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner and activist. Now, Andrew, I want to start with you this time. So what do you make of the fact that we have legislation now which basically makes it OK to discriminate against white men?
It's discrimination. It's wrong. This Equalities Act needs to go, and I hope that will be dumped once we have a new government in a few years' time, because it's done a huge amount of damage, terribly divisive.
You could have dumped it when you were in power.
Look, the last government failed on a whole range of things. In future, we've got to get these things right. The Equalities Act is divisive. It divides people up. We're all individuals. We're all different in lots of ways. There are no two people alike. And I like the fact that in this country, traditionally, people get to where they are because they're on merit. We had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. She was a woman right? She got there not because she was a woman, because she was a strong leader with a clear purpose and people voted her in. So I don't believe we should discriminate. I don't believe in identity politics. I don't believe in any of this. I think everybody should be able to get to where they want to be because they deserve it, because they worked for it, and they're purely there on their merit.
Parliament should reflect the society it represents and legislation.
Well, then to so-called minorities you need to give an uplift to. You're going to divide everybody up. And in the end, good people that could be there on merit can't be there because their place is being taken by someone else because they tick a certain box.
Too many white guys.
Absolutely
no,
wrong.
You should only be able to
this.
get there on merit. Just because you're of a certain race or sexuality or gender, that should not give you a free pass. You have to get there on merit as well.
But you can still overtake someone that could have been there because they don't tick the box that you've created.
And let's face it, identity politics is an invented hierarchy. It's created this oppression Olympics. It gives favour to those who somebody decided in 2010 with the Equality Act is oppressed, and it's given the oppressor rights, thank you very much, to people like us.
Yeah,
why, guys? I've never oppressed anybody in my life. Why should I be prevented from standing for Parliament because I don't tick a box?
Well, you wouldn't be prevented.
Well, I would be if there are enough men on the list already, if this was the law.
According to the Welsh system proposed, 50% representation would be male. So men would not be excluded. But you'd have your right. And the Equality Act does not privilege minorities.
So what happens if, as is presumably why we've got this legislation, not enough women are coming forward when it's a voluntary choice? What do we march them at gunpoint to go and stand as candidates?
No, of course not. But I think it's good to have political parties required to ensure that there is greater balance between men and women.
So you would make it, you would enforce it. You would force political parties to have a quota of women and other types of minorities and other types of people. Where would this end?
No, I'm not saying.
Where would it end?
I'm not saying, but I think in terms of gender balance, I mean, women are half of our society.
But would you have gender balance in all other walks of life as well, or is it only MPs?
Well, ideally, it'd be good to have more women. FTSE 100 CEOs, that would be great.
What about
They're
the bad jobs?
massively underrepresented.
What about the bad jobs? It's always the great jobs that we want more. What about bricklayers?
Well, they're all
men, sewage workers.
If you look at cleaners and other domestic workers, they're overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly low paid. So I think they deserve a better deal. OK,
let's call time on this debate about equality. Great stuff, gentlemen, with you, Andrew. The threat to MPs is clearly growing. Now, we've seen David Amos murdered, Mike Freer, of course, Finchley MP, his arson attack on his office at the last general election. He stood down as a candidate. Labour Party MPs have had it too. Vicky Foxcroft, Lewisham North. Sir Keir Starmer was harangued off a train in Glasgow. Rachel Reeves on the general election campaign. Apolitically, it seems to be a growing phenomenon, and the people perpetrating this seem to be the new intolerant pro-Palestine protesters. Is this a growing threat?
So it's 3 years since Sir David was murdered, and we still live with the horror of that moment. All of us that get elected are always potentially under threat from someone. We all have people in our constituencies who blame us for everything and come to our surgeries or come to our offices and say and do things which are completely inappropriate and sometimes threatening. But what happened to David and Joe Cox before him was absolutely horrific. I fear, however, that not enough is done to protect parliamentarians, but also the anger in society, a lot of it misplaced, I have to say, seems to generate hatred towards elected politicians. There's no easy answer to this, but I do believe that the authorities in this country need to take it much more seriously, how elected politicians and public figures generally are not protected and are not safe from carrying out their elected duties.
Thank you very much to you as well, Andrew Rosindell. Thank you so much for your company. Great show. Now, I'm going to be back tomorrow, 3 till 6 p.m. on my show. Up next, of course, is Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg with State of the Nation. Thanks for joining us. Have a fantastic evening. Now, here's your weather with Aidan McGibbon.